This is episode number 462 of the Health and Fitness Podcast by InnerFight, brought to you in association with Smith Street Paleo. Whether you want food delivered for your breakfast, lunch, dinner, or you just want a snack, go and check them out, smithstreetpaleo.com. Plenty of super tasty paleo food for you. Folks, please do not forget, Inner Talks is coming up. One of the biggest speakers that we have had to date. He is here at InnerFight live on Thursday, 11th of October. Super guy, Omar Noor. You don't want to miss it. Of course, for those of you international, we will be putting him on the podcast. This is a great conversation that Tom Walker and I have on today's podcast with an Italian guy on Skype. Excuse the slight quality. Follow his accent. Enjoy the show. Welcome back to another edition of the Health and Fitness Podcast, folks. And the guy that we have on the line with us today, I'm super excited about this. Marco Altini, mate, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Mate, heart rate variability for training. Those that have listened to Tom's endurance shows, Q&As, and a little bit to our podcast have heard about it. But please give us an introduction to heart rate variability for training. You are the creator of this amazing app.
Thanks. So, basically HRV for training is an app that allows you to measure cardiac variability, heart rate variability, which is, I would say at this point, the best proxy we have to physiological stress. And measuring stress can help us, making small adjustments in the context of training or lifestyle in general, so that we can try to get to, I would say, optimal performance in the long term. So, this way you can keep always in the loop the physiological response of your body to what is the training stimulus and other stressors, and make, training plannings that are truly individualized and take care of the response of the individual. So I would say that's in a nutshell what we try to do.
How did you give us a little bit of background on how you got into this as a topic? Because obviously for some people it'll sound quite specific, and obviously you have quite a big interest in it. So give us a little bit of background on that.
Yeah, so my background is actually more technical. So I've studied, computer science engineering, and then I did a PhD more on applied machine learning, artificial intelligence, these kind of things, but always in the context of interpreting data acquired from the human body and physiological data in general. Did a lot of research on, trying to estimate energy expenditure or cardiorespiratory fitness level using wearable sensors data, outside of the lab. All sorts of things that I was studying and publishing during my PhD years, were always using sensors that were prototypes we were making in this R&D institute. And, I always missed building something that, other people could actually use outside of the studies.
Right.
So that was, 7 years ago, I think, when I started. It was good timing because, you had the first iPhones that started to migrate towards Bluetooth 4.0, which changed a lot how things worked, right? You could finally connect an iPhone to basically sensors that were just available on the market, so people could use. Before it was a bit more complicated.
Yeah,
so then, I started looking at what physiological parameters you could measure in a simple way using a phone and a sensor. Things were not as comfortable as, some watches today, so you still had to use always the chest strap. So, investigating all of these aspects linked to measuring physiology and stress, I figured that, the morning measurement of physiological stress was one of the most simple and beneficial in terms of the insights you can get by measuring physiology in that context. And that's how the whole thing started. And at the very beginning, we would just measure heart rate at rest, like it has been done for 50 years in sports. Before HRV was easier and more common. Yeah. You would just measure heart rate at rest, or doing this orthostatic test where you lie down and then you stand and you look at the difference in heart rate. Very simple things that still should show a little the effect of these stressors on your body. And then moved into heart rate variability, and then again developed this technology to do the same using the phone camera. So instead of using the sensor, it made things a bit easier for the ones that don't have a sensor and don't want to invest, another 40, 50 euro on something else. Yeah.
Marco, why don't you just explain in simple terms what heart rate variability is? Because you used a lot of words like physiological stresses there and explained a few ways of measuring it. But what are you actually measuring?
Yeah, so what we measure here is very simple. Is your heart does not beat at a constant frequency. So what we measure are the variations between consecutive beats. These variations are not random. They are actually modulated by the autonomic nervous system response to stress. And the stress, we consider pretty much anything from, workouts, trainings, to, poor sleep or life stressors, work, any sort of factor that can influence your physiology, even, getting upset, reading something online, all sorts of things affect our physiology. And autonomic nervous system responds to this as it tries to maintain a state of balance, which is necessary for optimal functioning, through the parasympathetic and sympathetic branches. So what we measure with cardiac variability is, in particular, the effect that we have of the parasympathetic system, which tries to maintain this, state of, which is triggered, in the context of rest and recovery. So when we measure parasympathetic activity through a heart rate variability, that's the insights we get. Is our response, to the stressors, and our body is responding to all the stressors we go through. So what do we get from this heart rate variability? Basically, in an extreme oversimplification is that typically when our heart rate variability is higher, it means that parasympathetic activity is higher, so stress is lower, and in general our body is more rested and recovered. While when our HRV is lower, it means that there is higher stress. Yeah. So that's the core principle behind all of this work, in which we try to interpret then physiology in a way that is helpful in the context of performance.
Yeah, and then, so just a little plug for your app here. So HRV for Training is a brilliant app. One of the things I like about it a bit more than the others is you can add in tags, so you can build a bit of a database on how you slept, what your training was. It links in with Training Peaks really nicely. How do people? So you give them a score based on the algorithm from this app, and then so. What would you suggest to people if they're always coming in under-recovered? Does the baseline move down, so it just says that, okay, that's just their baseline? Or does the app work out a way of saying, here's what you should be at? So if your score comes in lower, it shows that you're under-recovered compared to a population, or is it always from the individual score?
So the way things work here are always, relative to your own historical data. So, as physiology, especially heart rate variability, is highly dependent also on, for example, on your genetics. I think in general, it doesn't make much sense to compare between people, but we should always be looking at our own historical data and take it from there. Then, of course, there are trade-offs, as you say. If you are always, below baseline for a certain period of time, then at a certain point that might become your new baseline, and then you are unable to understand when you are actually under higher or lower stress. So over the years, we tried to find, optimal parameters to define these baselines and normal values to provide advice to people. So what we came up with eventually is a rather long window in which we look at 2 months of your data, so that even, medium, long-term periods of high stress that take you below your baseline still are accounted for properly. Yeah. So we take 2 months of your data, look at, what's normal day-to-day variations for you, because what we should explain here is also that there is much variation in artery variability on a day-to-day basis. It jumps a bit more up and down than your resting heart rate if you're used to measuring that. Yeah. So that's something that makes it a bit more difficult to understand when these changes are significant, so to speak, when you should make adjustments and when it's just all normal variation. Yeah. So that's why we take this long time window. We take 2 months, look at how your normal array variability changes over time, and then each day we look at your daily score with respect to your normal variations. So, for example, your score is significantly lower than what are normal changes for you, then there is some clear acute stressor in there.
Yeah.
And then what the app does is to try, as you say, to combine that also with subjective parameters, because obviously, there are things that, while physiology tells you a lot, there are things that it cannot tell you about. For example, muscle soreness, right? You're sore in your muscles because you did an intense workout. Your physiology still looks good because maybe you're used to do these sessions frequently, and you cope well with your training, and everything's going great. Normally, what you would expect is physiology to be normal, but still you're very sore. It makes no sense to go hard again. So we combine then these physiological changes with your subjective feedback and try to provide meaningful advice, in the context of how you could make small adjustments on a day-to-day basis, push hard workout to another day, anticipate it if everything is going well, things like that.
So it's basically like a general wellness app, really, isn't it?
Yeah, well, the training application, let's say that it's easier to explain or to get people to use the app simply because in general someone that is interested in training or in competing in any sport, from professionals to just recreational athletes, is highly motivated. So is a person that in the morning will have no problems remembering to do the measurement and collecting this data. It's a bit more difficult if you don't have that drive to just make it a routine. I think that's a big part of it. So while physiology is of course relevant for anyone, because again what you measure is stress, and you cannot even separate stress that comes from training from stress that comes from other things. So it's just all stress. So
I think a lot of people don't realize that, actually.
I think that's one of the main things as well. Like, people will feel that they're not recovering, and is it from the workout or is it from, and it's I think training always gets blamed for it, doesn't it? It's like, I had a hard workout yesterday. Yeah, but the day before that, you traveled for business, you worked 15 hours, you sat on an aeroplane, you're uncomfortable. Like, that's all causing a massive amount of stress, right?
Exactly, and then maybe you planned, your recovery day for that day that you were traveling, across the ocean because you couldn't work out, and then, of course, that makes no sense, right? Because you just stress your body more, and you will need another day if you really wanted to do some recovery. So I think that's good that you can measure, all of the stress with one parameter, and then try to make adjustments that way. But indeed, all sorts of applications from, mental health, even just monitoring progress of certain chronic diseases, all sorts of conditions will affect your physiology and is reflected then in this resting measurement of cardiac variability.
Yeah. Cool. So, Marco, you got an interesting study using CrossFit athletes, which obviously we have a lot here. The study is titled Heart Rate Variability is a Moderating Factor in the Workload Injury Relationship of Competitive CrossFit Athletes. Why don't you tell us what you actually found and what the day-to-day CrossFit athlete who, trains 6 times a week can actually take from this? I think it's really important.
Sorry.
I think it's really important what you've put in there is workload injury relationship. Yeah.
So I think this is one of the most interesting studies that we did recently. I had a very marginal role here, but so basically what was done here. Well, first, just to so the sample size of this study was a bit small. So anything I'm saying here still should be replicated, with other studies. Bigger sample size, but still I think it was very interesting what the main researchers found. Basically, what they did was to look at 2 parameters that normally are very indicative of, either overtraining or issues with injuries, risk of injury. For example, one of them is the acute to chronic training load ratio. So this means simply, your acute training load is, so to speak, the recent training load. So maybe what you did last week or in the past 10 days, and your chronic training load is what you're used to do, so maybe taken from the past 6-7 weeks, right? So your acute to chronic training load ratio shows how much you've been done recently with respect to what you're used to do. Right. So if this number is high, it means simply that you've been doing a little too much with respect to what your body is used to handle, and that's of course something that is linked to injury risk. So another parameter here was heart rate variability. They used RMSSD, which is also the parameter we use in the app. It's again a clear marker of parasympathetic activity, so of recovery from this training stimulus. So then they looked at this data again within individuals, so always relative to their own historical data. A low HRV score, for example, would be a low score for a specific person given their historical data, as we said before. And what they tried to see was what of these parameters was linked to injury risk. So was it lower HRV? Was it a high acute to chronic training load ratio? So what they found was that acute to chronic ratio or lower MSSD are not necessarily associated to higher injury risk when you take them separately. However, for people that had a high acute to chronic training load ratio, so they were training very hard in the recent period with respect to their historical data, and in that same period add a lower HRV with respect to their historical data, they were much more prone to injury. So basically this highlighted how when you were loading more, if your body was not responding in an optimal way, which is typically, with a stable HRV or even an increasing HRV during high load for people that are responding very well to a certain stimulus, then if you actually are not responding well and your HRV is sinking, then probably loading that much is not good and you're at much higher risk of injury. So that was more or less what came out, and what I think is really applicable also to anyone doing this sport, right?
The part of it that really stood out was, I think, a lot of people, certainly that are coming here, the more they get stressed through work or life, the more they feel like they have to squeeze in like harder workouts and fill their time with basically harder workouts to feel like they've pushed harder because they've got less time or more stress taking up their life. So what this study is saying is, if when your HRV is reading your RMSSD is low, so you're in a state of stress anyway, and then you're going in and adding in high acute load, so maybe you'll go a lot heavier than you normally would or work out more intensively than you normally would, you're basically asking for injury. Is that what we...
Exactly.
Yeah?
Exactly. So that's what you see in this data. While, for other athletes that were pushing a bit harder and then they, had a good physiological response in terms of HRV, then the risk was lower. Similarly, people that had, lower HRV, but then, they did not went harder because, they had lower training load, then also they had lower injury risk.
Yeah. Cool.
Let's talk about a little bit the application, the app itself, and how people should use it, because we spoke there a little bit about when you spoke about sensors and a strap. So if you're just someone in the general public and you've bought into to sort of what we're talking about here, Marco, how does someone use your app? Let's start there.
Yeah, so I think the most important thing to understand is, context. So as we said before, physiology changes a lot also throughout the day in response to many acute stressors, things that are transient and will just fade away, like, having coffee or, again, reading your email, things like that. That's not what you want to measure, the effect of those factors. So the most important thing is measuring in, relaxed, known context before you're affected by all of these confounding factors, which means as soon as you wake up. The easiest thing is that you wake up still in bed, lying down, take your measurements before doing anything else. That's typically what works well to measure, this underlying chronic physiological stress, which is what we care about for our insights.
And there's two ways to do that on the app, right? We can use the sensor on our camera or a heart rate chest strap.
Exactly. So the app is compatible with all the main Bluetooth sensors. What we recommend normally is Polar, H7 or H10. That's because we validated them in some of our studies. So with respect to an ECG, so full electrocardiogram that is used normally, in the lab. So the sensor show to be equivalent. Right. Same thing is the technology we developed with the camera, which is for some people a bit more convenient. So in that case, you just put the finger on the back camera of your phone, and then we measure blood flow. So, obviously your blood is flowing when your heart is beating. So what you measure there is the same temporal relationship between beats.
Right.
And then, with the analysis we do there, basically we can estimate your heart rate variability also using the phone camera. Another method that we validated with respect to both the chest straps and the ECG, again showing that is equivalent. So, if people want to have a strap, they can just use this method, and it's pretty simple. And once you took your measurement, as soon as you wake up, then there's this set of questions that you can customize, which allow you to gather even more context, around sleep quality, your workouts, lifestyle, if you've been traveling or if you had, a drink last night, all sorts of things that will help you then later better understand, how your data is trending and why.
Talking about, like, when we've given it to people to use, like, we obviously give it to a lot of our clients to use. We're like, you need to go and get this app, which, folks, if you are thinking of getting the app, head over to Marco's website. All these articles and studies that we're speaking about are actually on there, hrv4training.com. I'll also put a link to the app in the App Store in the show notes, so you guys can check that out. But one of the things that, and it's about $10, which is a fragment of the price that the value it gives. Is quite funny, because we were speaking about this the other day when someone comes to start maybe a triathlon program and they've just spent somewhere maybe around 10,000 euros on a bike, and then we ask them to buy your app for $10 and they freak out. But that's
I think the perception of software is always different.
But I can tell you guys, I bought into this app at the start, and it is worth every single cent. But what I was coming back to, staying on the reading on the sensors, mate, is that people are actually quite sort of shocked that we can get this level of information through passing our finger or our thumb over the camera on a smartphone. You've obviously done some quite in-depth studies to validate the data on that. Like, what could go wrong there? Like, could people potentially have their finger in on a funny angle? What's there to look out for to make sure that we get a super accurate reading?
I think in that case, really, movement is the key. So it's extremely important not to move. That's why for camera measurements, I would recommend to stick to the 60 seconds, maximum 2 minutes, because then it might be, you might lose even the convenience of that. If you have to stay there without moving for 5 minutes, it's a bit too long. These measurements now are validated also as short measurements, so that they give you the same information. I would recommend using 1 or 2 minutes. And then indeed, movement, I think, is the most problematic thing for any optical measurement. The phone camera, but also watches and other things that are used even just for basic heart rate while working out. Often they don't work well because of that movement. All of them would work great at rest. So the fact that we measure at rest puts us in the best position, but still you have to be a little careful with the camera. Maybe practice once or twice. There is a practice mode in the app to make that simple. And then,
But from the studies,
I know a lot of people that. Sorry, go ahead.
No, from the studies that you've done, the accuracy of is there any disparity between the accuracy of having like you said, Polar H7 heart rate strap or using your finger? Is there a percentage variance, or what did you find?
In these studies, we showed that there are equivalent methods, so you can use one or the other. It doesn't really matter.
Right. Good. So like you said, if people are not really ready to spend an extra $40, 40 euros on a chest strap, they can start using the app. I think one thing, and this is, again, folks, speaking from my personal experience, when I first started using the app, I was using my finger, and, then actually I came across, I found online quite a cheap Polar H7. H7 is the older, the H10 is the newer version, isn't it? I think H7 is a little bit cheaper, and it's actually just, like you were saying there, Marco, it's just a lot more convenient to put the chest strap on and be laid down and be relaxed in a relaxed position for that 1 or 2 minutes when you wake up. I just found it a lot more user-friendly to have a strap, but still we get the accuracy through the camera, as you said, so that's good as well.
Yeah. I think it's a bit subjective in this case. Everyone is comfortable with the different systems, so we give the options, and then they'll pick what they prefer.
So, mate, we've collected the data, and for example, someone's listened to the show and they're going out, they're getting the app. How can they use this data? What is your sort of go-to? What should people be looking out for? What should they be aware of? And how should they manage their training based on the data that they're getting from HRV for Training app?
So what I normally say is that, first thing is just to collect data for a few weeks, get to understand a little how the numbers change with respect to what you do in your, normal training plan and lifestyle. Get an idea of, just let's say an awareness phase, of your physiology. And then in general, something else where I see there is sometimes a bit of confusion is that, you start using a tool and then sometimes you depend become a little too dependent on the tool, or you let the tool being the only thing that guides your training. And I think that there is a bit of confusion with HRV in this context, which is, normally what you expect is things to be normal and just to be following your training plan. So the first thing you should have is to have a training plan, and then to use HRV for small adjustments when things do not, go as expected. So if you work, independently and you build your own training plan, or if you work with a coach, the first thing is always, check what you have planned and go with your training plan, and then based on your physiological response, you can make some adjustments. Right. And again, what you expect most of the time is really things to be within normal. So it means that you have a good periodization. Your training plan is working well. Your body is responding well to the load and the training load you're putting on it. Mm-hmm. And then what you want to see is, for example, a stable trend in HRV or an upward trend in HRV when you increase load, things that show that there is a good physiological adaptation. And if you don't see that, you see HRV going down, then it means you might want to make some adjustments because your body needs more recovery. That's one of the most basic examples. And another thing you wanna look at, for example, is what we call the coefficient of variation of HRV. Right. So here we don't look just at your HRV baseline and how it's trending recently, but we look actually at day-to-day changes. So, for example, if you have a certain baseline, as baseline we mean your average of the past week, right? Right. So that average could come from having every day the same score, or it could come from scores jumping around a lot, but averaging at that same number, right? So that's why you need some other parameters to analyze how things have been going recently, not only your baseline score. And this coefficient of variation is exactly telling you that. It's telling you how much variability on a day-to-day basis you had recently. And this has been linked in research to poor adaptation. So a high coefficient of variation, scores jumping a lot, has shown multiple times to be linked to poor adaptation to a certain training block. So if you start, a new training block, there is more load. Still, you want to stress the body, but if you see, maybe HRV trending down and the coefficient of variation going up, so scores in general are lower, but they also jump a lot day to day, then, two signals that you might not be adapting well and you might want to change something. So these analyses are done in the app for you. So once you have about a month of data that we can interpret all these things for you, you will see there's an insights section where we cover, what we call HRV trends, these multiple parameters analysis, where we try to understand how you're basically responding to a specific training block, if you're coping well, if there is risk, of maladaptation or accumulating fatigue and things like that.
Very cool.
Yeah. And Marco, from your experience with the data you've collected from the app, obviously training affects the HRV score, but what about nutrition and sleep, what people are putting in, lifestyle, because there's a travel tag? What else have you found effects that people can take away from this?
I think, really the basics of healthy lifestyle, starting with good sleep, especially for people that train a lot. The big factors that we know we should put priority in, I think they reflect very well in HRV. If you have a very bad night, sleep 2 hours, go to bed late, and then have to go somewhere early in the morning, those kind of things typically trigger low scores, and sometimes they can last also a couple of days, which means it's going to take time then to get things back to normal.
And have you got data on that?
Sorry?
Have you got data on that? Have you got a study on that?
No, so we haven't published anything looking at these subjective scores, but I would say there is enough literature also from others showing in general, the effect of poor sleep on physiology. I think those can be linked also to changes in resting heart rate variability. I would say sleep definitely the most important aspect to give priority to, and then of course all the big ones, diet again, and then it's more difficult to control things like travel, especially if it is for work. So again, trying to put priority to the things you can control a little more in those contexts, even sleep and proper food and things like that will stress less the body, is always beneficial. Then you have this feedback where you can check basically how things are going. Also, travel is depends a lot on the type of trip. I see if you travel for some stressful events and very packed
holiday
schedule and things like that, it's very different than taking a few days off and relax. So some of these things are difficult to analyze from a black box, without knowing the context and what was actually going on in a person's life. So at the individual level, yourself can see that and understand that easily. But for us, if a person, if we analyze data at the population level and, a person is traveling, I think we miss the reason why they're traveling, which can be, also changing things a lot.
How long the flight's been? And time zone change, because I would imagine jet lag would affect this. Also.
Yeah, certainly. Another thing that is one of the major challenges, also I would say, for people that work shifts, then it becomes very difficult even to understand when you can gather this data, because the sleep patterns change so much. What I recommend normally, that's the only case in which I would recommend not to stick to the morning routine and the usual monitoring always at the same time. And in this case, I would, as you know, sleep as such a strong factor, and then you still need to account for all the other confounding factors. So I would always say, better to measure when you wake up, even if you have these inconsistent sleep patterns in this case.
Okay, so if you work shifts, the time to do it is whenever you're waking up, not at the same time each day.
Yes, that would be my recommendation, even though, it's still difficult to understand if we are affecting too much then things with, changing circadian rhythm and so on. So I would do that, and then I would tag it in the app. You can have these custom tags. I would say, if you have a shift, you just tag it there, so then later you can analyze how this is having an impact also on your scores.
When it's one thing that I think people should be aware of, and I'm quite keen to get your thoughts on this, Marco, is people that are racing, and I guess on a race day, if there is natural nerves, like as we all know, no matter how big or small a race is, that often the night before sleep is not ideal. We could potentially expect a lower reading on the day of a race, which then obviously could make the athlete feel like they're under-recovered going into a race. What's your thoughts on that? Have you studied anything on that or seen anything on that?
Yeah, I would say this is quite common. Both poor sleep and also a bit of anxiety in the morning when you do the measurements. So if that affects someone negatively, I would simply do not show the measurement for that day. So that's something you can set. You can set and you hide the daily advice, so you can still take the measurement, but you don't see anything. Then you can look at it after the race. So that way it doesn't affect you psychologically. I think it's a good way to do that.
That's a cool point. One thing that you've also developed is you have for those that are coaches or are coaching a number of athletes, there's a coach's sort of dashboard, a coach's version of that. Do you want to speak to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that's something we launched just this year. This web platform where you can monitor your athletes remotely. I think there we really try to show a bit better these aspects linked to abstracting a little more, not getting stuck in the day-to-day variation and daily score, even as you just mentioned, the possibly low score on race day, these kind of things. I think we need to abstract a little more, look at higher level trends, look at the baseline, look at how things, if your baseline is good, which means in the past few weeks you've been training well, you've been tapering well, everything looked good, then you shouldn't worry at all about the score you get on race day, because so many other factors could influence that in an acute way, which is irrelevant. If your training has been going well, then you just go confident in your race.
Yeah.
So in the training, in the web platform, we try to show that a little better. Show how your baseline changes with respect to your normal values when it's below those. Provide ways to visualize in a single chart how your subjective scores are trending this week with respect to your past weeks, so that you can just in a quick way get an understanding of how sleep is trending, how fatigue is trending, and that also linked to physiology, heart rate variability at rest, all these kind of things. So providing these overviews, I think, can help than making the right adjustments and getting a little less overwhelmed by the data, because they try to be there's a lot of data, but we try to again abstract a bit more in there and show what should matter the most, which are the recent trends with respect always to context, training, and anything else.
And Marco, are you also looking for, as you say we're 3 weeks out from the event or the race, whatever it is you're about to start, you'd look for that final build to obviously break the body down to get the adaptation within the taper week. So you'd expect to see HRV dropping, and then you'd also expect to see during the taper it to be building up, right?
I would say it depends. So sometimes yes. I think sometimes it depends also on the history of the athlete. Some athletes, say world-class Ironman, they train so many hours each week for so many years that it's hard to sync their HRV. It's things tend to stay within normal, and some of them, their body responds very well to high training load. Like my friend Daniel Plus, who's been doing so much research on HRV and elite athletes, he shows how when he puts some of these athletes through the most intense blocks, their HRV actually goes above normal values with the baseline for several days, because they respond very well to that kind of intensity. And then during tapering, it goes down, but it doesn't go down, below normal. It just goes back to normal. So that's why you should always analyze everything with respect to their own historical data. And I don't see this happening much with the with the rest of us, so to speak.
What's causing the HRV to actually rise then when he's putting them through really hard workouts? Is that the fact it's going too far into the parasympathetic nervous system?
Well, I wouldn't know, honestly. It could be that it's some sort of reaction, but normally when you have that, it's more of a sporadic, you would have, like, if you have a one high score after a very hard workout, then that could be that your body is working too hard in this parasympathetic state. But when you have that sustained for a longer period of time, it could be that it's simply a good response of the body to the training load. I think this happens typically only in these elite athletes.
So you'd say you can't read into the fact that it's chronically high, if we say chronically, but it's high for, say, 3 days. You would say that's not the body trying to put itself into a harder state of recovery. You'd say actually they've reacted well to the training.
Yeah, I would say so. If you see the baseline going up, that instead of just the daily score, it's difficult for the baseline to go above normal values, because it means you need to be above normal values for several days, because the baseline is built on a week of data. So in that case, I would normally say that that's just good adaptation to a specific block you're doing, which doesn't mean you should, of course, be pushing that for too long. But again, these athletes, they have, again, good periodizations and polarized training plans, and everything comes with the adequate recovery.
Yeah.
So this is then a good way to analyze the data.
So that brings me on to a point actually I was going to pick up earlier. So when people are looking at their scores, should we always try to be getting a higher HRV score? Like, if people are coming in and they start using the app and they're saying, oh, my HRV score is this, and obviously we don't want to compare individual to individual, but from what that data shows with the athletes, do we want that? Do we want to always try and get a higher HRV?
I think in general what we want is really things to be within normal, as boring as that sounds. It's something that for physiology in general, normal is good. Abnormal is something to be more cautious about, both in the high and low end.
Yeah.
And of course, your things can be improved, right? So again, the big factors, proper sleep, proper diet, those might have also changed an effect, in your long-term chronic baseline. And then that's, of course, important, so that small gains can be made also in your baseline. You're not forever associated to what you start with. At the same time, I think HRV is more of a tool to use as continuous feedback for small adjustments, more than, for example, you have resting heart rate, clear link to fitness. Yeah. You take a person that is unfit, go through some training program, for example, just basic running or cycling, aerobic exercise, their heart rate will go lower as they get fitter.
Yeah.
Quite standard relationship that you see pretty much on any person. HRV, not necessarily going that way. So
yeah.
I think what matters there is really this continuous feedback more than optimizing it towards a certain value in the long run.
So it's more of a cautionary tool than anything.
Yeah, I would say so.
Very good. Marco, I think we've taken plenty of your time there, mate, and there's so much information. I definitely suggest that people listen to this show at least twice, because, I mean, it is, obviously you come at it from quite a scientific perspective, and I think that's given what we're saying to a lot of our clients and also podcast listeners, a lot more validity of how to use HRV, but it's definitely a tool that people should be having within their armory. So, mate, we just really want to thank you for taking the time to come on the show, and definitely people should be going to check you out, hrvfortraining.com. And as I said, I've put links to the app. It is a very small investment, guys. Yeah, Marco needs to eat so that he can function, and he also needs that $10 so that he can have Wi-Fi in his house, have a computer to do podcasts like this and share the information. So
thanks a lot, guys. It's been great talking to you.
We really appreciate you, mate, and congratulations on what you've done with HRV for Training so far, and we'll stay in touch. Hopefully maybe we'll see you in Dubai. And for the folks that are thinking about hopping over and using HRV, definitely do it. And I can say for myself, the service from Marco and his team at HRV for Training is absolutely awesome. So, mate, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Awesome, guys. Thank you.
Thanks.